Hi. So in this lecture, we're going to look at objects and classes in general, just some basic concepts. So what is an object? And hopefully you've come across that before already, so none of this will be new. But if you are new to this, how can we think of an object? Well, we can think of an object as a container. And it's a container that has certain things. It contains data, and sometimes we call that data state, and also we call them attributes. So the data in a container can be accessed via things called attributes. We'll see what those are. It also contains functionality, which is more things like behavior. So you can think of a container, this object, this container object containing data and containing functions, essentially, and we package them all together. And then we can do a variety of things with them. But the basic thing is that's what it is. So, for example, we might have this object called myCar, right? And we've seen objects in Python all the time, and we've seen that objects have behaviors and they have data, like a list, for example. A list contains data, but it also has behavior. We can look, let's say, at the element at some index. We can remove something in the list. We can change the value in the list. All these are functionalities, behaviors that lists implement. We can sort a list, right? It has a sorting method that we can call. So in general, that's the case with any object. So if we have myCar, whatever type that is, it's just some object, let's say, and maybe it has a brand, which is Ferrari, and it has a model, and it has a year. Well, all these are state. That's the state of the object. But now we can also have things like accelerate and brake and steer. Well, that's not really state, right? That's more functionality. That's the behavior. We can accelerate and brake and steer our cars. So that's the difference between state and behavior. Now, how do we access those things? The most common way is to use dot notation. So for example, we might say mycar.brand and we'll get Ferrari back. Or we might say mycar.purchaseprice equals 1.6 million. There, we're assigning a value to a piece of state, to an attribute, right? Brand, purchase price are all called attributes. Now, accelerate is also called an attribute, but it's a different type of attribute. That's actually functionality. That's a function, and we call those things methods in general, and we'll see why later. So we might say mycar.accelerate, and then we can even pass in arguments to it, or mycar.steer. So how do we create this container? How do we create these custom containers, right? We've seen how we can create list objects and tuples and dictionaries and functions and modules. All these are objects. But how do we create our own objects? Well, again, you've probably seen that before. We'll use the class keyword. But then comes the question of how do we define and set the state of that object? And how do we define and implement behavior? And then we're going to have to differentiate between state and behavior for the class, which is an object, but it's still the class definition, and instances of the class. So we have to differentiate between state and behavior, between those two things. So we'll come back to that. Now, many languages use a class-based approach to create these container objects, to define these container objects. So C++, Java, and of course Python. So a class, think of it as a template, as a blueprint used to create those objects. Now, that class, that template, is also called a type. So that's why when we call, let's say, when we talk about the lists in Python, we say it's a type, but it's actually a class as well, right? It's the list class, but we also call it a type. So that's just synonymous terms. So objects created from that class are called instances. Just like we have an instance of a list or an instance of a dictionary, if we have a class that's called, let's say, car, we can have instances of the car type or the car class, and those are called instances of that class or of that type, right? So when we have, let's say, myCar, that's an instance of type car if we use the car class. And we'll see that in code. So the one thing that's really important to understand is that classes, types, are themselves objects, just like everything else in Python. Functions are objects, modules are objects, right? Dictionaries are objects. Everything is an object. Well, classes themselves are objects. So they have attributes, they have state, right? For example, the class name. When we create a class, we give them a name. Well, that name has to be stored somewhere. Well, it's stored with that class object, with that type. That's the type name or the class name. They also have behavior. For example, we can create instances of that class. Well, that's a behavior of that class, right? That doesn't just come out of nowhere. It kind of does for us because Python does that for us in the background, but it actually basically implements attributes and methods for our classes for us. That's how we can create instances of classes. So if a class is an object, and objects are created from classes, how are classes created, right? Where do they come from? So I'm not going to get into that now. This gets pretty complicated, but there is this concept of a meta class. It's something that kind of sits above. It's a type as well, right? It's a meta class, and it allows us to create classes. But I'm not going to get into meta programming at this point. So classes have behavior, right? They are callable. We can call my class. If my class is a class definition, we'll see how to do that in a bit, we can call it. And that's a behavior that Python gives us. And that will return an instance of the class. And we'll get to the instances a little bit later in this section. So a little bit of terminology. Very often in object-oriented programming, we call the class, and instances of the class the objects. But really in Python, everything is an object. My class is an object. Instances of my class are also objects. They just have different types. The type of my class is type. The type of an instance of my class is my class. So very often we try and differentiate between the instance objects and the class by calling them objects versus class. So you'll see that sometimes in other programming languages, especially in Java. I will try and stick to that as well, but I often don't because my class is just an object as well. But we have to keep track of instances of the class versus the class definition, the class object itself. Okay? So instances are created from classes, from types. So their type is the class they were created from. So if my class is a class in Python and my object is an instance of that class that we create this way, my object equals my class and we call it, then if we look at the type function and we pass it this instance object, we will actually get the my class object back, right? We're going to get an object back. We're not getting a string back here. We're actually getting the my class object. We can also use the isInstance method. So we can request Python to tell us, is my object an instance of my class? And in this case, it will return true because my object was indeed an instance of my class. And we'll look at how all that works and how we actually use all that in detail later. So how do we create a class? Well, we use the class keyword. I'm sure you've seen this before because I've used it a lot throughout this series. So let's do the simplest possible class that we can, this class definition. So class my class, and I'm just going to pass. So this is a no op. I'm not going to actually provide any extra functionality to this class. This is, as far as we're concerned, it looks like an empty class. Now, a couple of things. When this code is compiled, is run, is encountered by Python, it creates the my class object. Just like when you have a def with a function, and when it runs across that code, it compiles the function, right? It creates this function object. Well, the same thing with classes. So if this is sitting in the root of your module, when your module is imported, is loaded, then this my class object will get created, just like the functions get created when the module is loaded up. So Python creates this object. Now this object has a name, just like a function has a name. This object has a name called my class. Now the type of my class is the type object, right? It will be type. We'll see that in the code. Now one thing that's nice is that Python automatically provides certain attributes, state and methods and behaviors to this particular object. Just like when we create a function, yes, we have the function code that we create and the arguments and so on, but there's a bunch of extra things that Python puts into that function object for us. Well, the same thing when we create a class. So even though here I have an empty class, there are certain attributes and methods that are already basically there. For example, the Dundon name attribute. So this is going to contain the string which is the name of the class, my class. So this will actually be a string. That's state. Now it also provides behaviors. We can actually call this object. This object is a callable. We can call it. And when we do that, Python is going to create and return an instance of that particular type. That's behavior. So even though this looks like an empty class, we already have built-in state and behavior that Python provides for us. So if we take a look at the type of my class, as I've said before, the type of my class is type. It will actually return the type object. That's an object in Python. We can also check, is instance my class and type, and that will return true. Again, we'll see that in the code. So let's switch to that, and let's just take a look at that very quickly. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a bit.